The veil tore mid-vow. His mother ripped it from Denise's head so violently the pins scraped her scalp, then walked down the aisle and placed it gently on his mistress like she was crowning a queen. The pastor didn't stop. The groom didn't move. Not a single soul spoke. Denise stood there, bare, shaking, humiliated in front of everyone. They humiliated her at the altar, not knowing she owned everything beneath their feet. The church was full. 200 guests packed into oak pews with white ribbons tied at the ends. Sunlight came through the stained glass and painted the floor in soft golds and blues. It was the kind of afternoon that felt chosen, the kind of setting that made you believe something beautiful was about to happen. And it was beautiful, for a moment. Denise stood at the altar in a fitted ivory gown her grandmother would have loved. Her hands were steady. Her veil was pinned just right. She had done her own makeup that morning because she couldn't afford a stylist, and she'd spent 45 minutes on her edges alone. She looked like a painting. Marcus stood across from her in a charcoal suit, jaw tight, eyes somewhere between bored and distracted. Pastor Henley had his Bible open to Corinthians. Everything was in place. The vows had started when the movement began. Lorraine Taylor stood from the front pew like she was answering a call from God himself. She didn't rush. She smoothed the front of her lavender dress, adjusted the brooch on her collar, and walked toward the altar with the calm of a woman who had already rehearsed this moment in her bathroom mirror. Every guest turned. Nobody stopped her. The ushers stood frozen. One of them even stepped aside. She reached Denise, looked her up and down the way you look at something you're about to remove from your house. And then she grabbed the veil. Not gently, not with ceremony. She grabbed it like she was pulling a tablecloth, and the pins dragged across Denise's scalp so hard her head jerked sideways. 2 pins clattered to the floor. A thin scratch appeared just above Denise's left ear. A line of red on brown skin, barely visible unless you were standing close enough to see her tremble. Lorraine didn't look back. She turned and walked the veil down the aisle with both hands, holding it in front of her like a crown on a velvet pillow. She stopped at the 4th row. And there sat Tiffany Grant, 26. Long braids pulled over one shoulder, a cream-colored dress that wasn't white but wasn't far from it. She didn't look surprised. She looked ready. She tilted her head forward slightly, and Lorraine draped the veil over her hair with the kind of tenderness she had never once shown Denise. She pressed the fabric into place with her fingertips, patted Tiffany's cheek, and whispered something only the 2 of them could hear. Then Lorraine turned to the pastor and nodded. Pastor Henley cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and kept reading. He didn't pause. He didn't ask what happened. He read the next line of the vows like a man who had been told in advance that this would happen and had already made his peace with it. Marcus didn't move. His jaw stayed locked. His eyes shifted once, toward Tiffany, then back to the altar. He didn't reach for Denise, didn't touch her, didn't even adjust his stance. He stood there like a man watching weather change through a window. And Denise stood at the altar with her scalp stinging and her hands at her sides, and her veil gone. The church was silent except for the pastor's voice. 200 people watched her. Not one of them stood. Not one of them spoke. Marcus's aunts and cousins exchanged glances from across the aisle like something overdue had finally been handled. One of his cousins actually nodded. Denise's chest rose, fell, rose again. Her fingers curled into her palms. Something behind her eyes shifted. Not tears, not rage. Something deeper. Something that didn't have a name yet. She blinked once, twice. Then she uncurled her hands, turned from the altar, and walked down the aisle toward the exit. Slowly. Back straight. No sound. No scene. Just a bride leaving her own wedding without a veil, without a groom, and without a single person following her. She pushed through the double doors and stepped into the Atlanta sun. Still in her gown, pins still in her hair, that thin red scratch drying above her ear. She sat down on the church steps and folded her hands in her lap like she was waiting for a bus. A few minutes later, she heard laughter inside. Someone had made a toast. Glasses were clinking. Music had started. They were celebrating. Not her leaving, her absence. Like the ceremony had been waiting for her to go so the real event could begin. The woman they had just humiliated in front of God and family was sitting 10 feet from the door, and they had already moved on to the champagne. Denise touched the scratch above her ear. Her fingers came back with a faint smear of red. She looked at it, then wiped it on the skirt of her wedding dress, the dress she'd saved for 11 months to buy. A small blood stain on ivory fabric. She didn't wince. She just pressed her hands back together and stared at the parking lot. Inside the church, the only person who looked like their heart was breaking was an elderly woman in the back row. She wore a navy dress and clutched a small handbag with both hands. Her eyes were wet. Her lips were pressed tight. She had watched the whole thing without moving, and now she sat there staring at the doors Denise had just walked through like she was watching history repeat itself in the cruelest possible way. Nobody knew her name. Nobody asked why she was crying, and nobody, not a single soul in that church, knew that the land this building sat on, the lot beneath the parking garage, and the entire block stretching to the corner of Peachtree, all belonged to a trust, and the only living heir to that trust had just walked outside, bareheaded, bleeding, and alone. To understand who Denise was, you had to go back. Not to Atlanta, not to the church. You had to go back to a small house on a dirt road outside Savannah, Georgia, where the trees hung so low they touched the roof, and the porch creaked every time the wind blew. That's where Mama Opal raised her. Denise's mother died during childbirth. There were complications the small county hospital wasn't equipped to handle, and by the time the ambulance could have taken her somewhere better, it was already too late. Denise came into the world the same night her mother left it. Mama Opal wrapped the baby in a yellow blanket, brought her home, and never once called it a burden. Denise never knew her father. Mama Opal only ever said one thing about him: "Your daddy loved you. That's all you need to carry." She said it the same way every time. Calm. Final. Like it was a door she had closed and locked a long time ago and had no intention of reopening. So Denise carried it. She carried it to school in her second-hand shoes. She carried it to the library where she spent her afternoons because the house didn't have internet. She carried it through every birthday that came and went without a party. Every father-daughter event she sat out. Every moment a kid at school reminded her she didn't have parents, plural, like the word orphan was something they'd earned the right to throw. But Denise never fought back. She'd just go quiet, go still. She'd open her notebook, pick up her pencil, and keep going. Mama Opal used to say, "That child don't break. She just bends low enough for the storm to pass." On Denise's 16th birthday, Mama Opal gave her a small gold locket. It was old. The clasp was a little stiff. Inside was a faded photograph of a man Denise had never seen before. Dark skin, serious eyes, a jaw that looked carved from something permanent. He was wearing a suit and standing in front of a building she didn't recognize. Denise asked who he was. Mama Opal pressed the locket into her palm and closed her fingers around it. "When the time comes," she said, "this will make sense." That was the last real gift Mama Opal ever gave her. She passed 3 years later, quiet, in her sleep, like she'd timed her own departure the same way she'd timed everything else in her life, without making a fuss. She left Denise the house, which was paid off, a Bible with dried flowers pressed between the pages, and a sealed envelope with the name of a law firm printed on the front, Whitfield and Associates. Mama Opal had tucked it inside a shoebox on the top shelf of her closet, behind a row of Sunday hats Denise hadn't touched since the funeral. Denise held that envelope the night after the burial. She sat on the edge of Mama Opal's bed, turning it over in her hands, smelling the faint lavender that still clung to the sheets. She almost opened it, her thumb even pushed under the flap. But the grief was too heavy. The house was too quiet. The idea of learning one more thing she wasn't ready for felt like it might flatten her completely. So she put it back in the shoebox, closed the lid, and left for Atlanta 2 weeks later with a suitcase, a bus ticket, and the locket around her neck. She worked 2 jobs through college: a front desk at a dentist's office during the day and stocking shelves at a grocery store 3 nights a week. She graduated with a degree in business administration. Not top of her class, but close enough. She got a job as an office coordinator at a mid-size marketing firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She paid her rent on time. She ate simply. She kept the locket on and the shoebox unopened. She met Marcus Taylor at a cookout in Buckhead. A friend of a co-worker invited her. Marcus was there in a linen shirt, laughing loud, telling stories, working the grill like he owned the backyard and everyone in it. He had the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. His family owned 4 car dealerships across Atlanta. His mother, Lorraine, was a deaconess at one of the biggest churches on the South Side. The Taylors weren't old money, but they were comfortable money. The kind of family that confused volume with value. Marcus noticed Denise because she was the only woman at that cookout who didn't notice him. She was sitting on the porch steps, eating a plate of food and scrolling her phone, and something about her stillness caught him. He sat down next to her, told her she had the best posture he'd ever seen at a barbecue. She didn't laugh. She said, "My grandmother would have made me leave if I slouched." He was hooked. He pursued her hard for 3 months, flowers at her job, dinner at places she'd never been. He picked her up in a different car twice a week and opened every door like it was a performance. He told her she was different. He told her she was special. He told her he'd never met a woman who made silence feel like a language. And Denise, who had never been pursued by anyone, believed him. Not because she was naive, but because she had been alone for so long that someone choosing her felt like proof she had survived for a reason. She gave him things she'd never given anyone. Not money. She didn't have any. She gave him trust. She told him about Mama Opal, about the house in Savannah, about growing up without parents and what it does to a child when every other kid gets picked up from school by someone and you walk home alone. She told him she used to set 2 plates at dinner, even when she was eating by herself, just so the table didn't look so empty. Marcus listened, held her hand, said all the right things, and filed every vulnerability away like a man organizing a drawer he might need later. They dated for 2 years. He proposed on a rooftop downtown with a ring that cost more than Denise made in 3 months. She said yes with tears running down her face. Lorraine said nothing. She sat at the engagement dinner with a smile that never reached her eyes and told her friends afterward, "That girl has no people, no name, no nothing. He'll learn." What Denise didn't know was that Marcus had his own reasons for proposing, reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with appearance, but that truth was still buried, and so was the envelope in the shoebox, and so was the name of the man in the locket. After the altar, Denise went home. She sat in the apartment she'd shared with Marcus for 8 months, still in her wedding dress, and waited. She waited for him to walk through that door and explain, to apologize, to hold her face in his hands and tell her his mother had lost her mind and he was sorry and they'd fix this together. He didn't come that night, didn't come the next morning, didn't text, didn't call. 2 full days passed before Marcus walked through the door, and when he did, he wasn't carrying flowers, he was carrying a duffel bag. He told her Tiffany was pregnant, 4 months along. He said it the way someone reads a line off a receipt, flat, factual, already processed. He told Denise that his mother had decided Tiffany was better suited for the family. That the wedding was never going to happen, that the altar moment was Lorraine's way of making it official. He said the apartment lease was in his name and she had until the end of the month to leave. Denise sat on the edge of the bed and listened. She didn't argue, didn't cry. She just looked at him the way you look at someone you're memorizing for the last time. And then she asked one question. "Did you ever love me?" Marcus picked up the duffel bag. "I liked who I was when I was with you," he said, "but that's not the same thing." And he walked out. Denise sat on that bed for 3 hours after the door closed. She didn't move. She didn't reach for the phone. She didn't call a friend because she didn't have the kind of friends you call at midnight when your life falls apart. She had co-workers who liked her. She had people who smiled at her in hallways. But she didn't have the kind of person who drives across town at 2 in the morning with food and a blanket and stays until the sun comes up. She had never had that. Mama Opal was that person. And Mama Opal was gone. So she sat alone in an apartment that still smelled like Marcus's cologne, wearing a wedding dress she'd never walk another aisle in, and she let the silence do what silence does when there's nothing left to say. It filled every corner. It pressed against the walls. It sat beside her on the bed like a guest that would never leave. In the days that followed, Denise learned the full scope of the betrayal. It came in pieces, the way all devastating truths do. One conversation at a time, one discovery at a time, each one worse than the last. Tiffany wasn't new. She'd been in Marcus's life for over a year. Before the proposal, before the ring, before the rooftop and the tears and the 3 months of flowers at Denise's job. Marcus had been splitting his time between 2 women and had never lost a single night of sleep over it. The engagement to Denise had been strategic. Lorraine wanted a quiet, manageable woman for public appearances. Someone with no family to complicate things. No connections to leverage, no voice loud enough to challenge the Taylor name. Denise was supposed to be a placeholder, a face for the photos until Tiffany's situation could be resolved. When Tiffany got pregnant, the plan shifted. The placeholder was no longer needed. The altar humiliation wasn't an impulse. Lorraine had orchestrated every detail. She'd told the pastor 3 days before the wedding what would happen and offered a generous donation to keep him quiet. She'd seated Tiffany in the 4th row on purpose, close enough to be seen, far enough to not cause suspicion before the moment hit. She'd even had a second dress delivered to Tiffany's house the morning of the ceremony, a white one, in case the day went the way Lorraine wanted. This was never a wedding. It was a public execution wrapped in white linen and scripture. And Tiffany had been inside Denise's apartment. Multiple times. She'd sat on Denise's couch while Denise was at work. She'd worn Denise's robe. She'd eaten from Denise's plates. She'd sat across from Lorraine at the Taylor family kitchen table and laughed while Lorraine called Denise that orphan girl. They'd toasted to the day the veil would come off. Denise packed a single bag and moved into a motel off the interstate, the kind of place where the ice machine hums all night and the walls are thin enough to hear the television next door. She sat on the edge of the motel bed and stared at the wall the way she had stared at the altar. Still. Empty. Like someone had reached inside her and turned everything off. She kept the wedding dress. She didn't know why. It was hanging in the motel closet, still stained with that small smear of blood on the skirt. She couldn't look at it, but she couldn't throw it away either. It was the last thing she'd bought with hope, and some part of her wasn't ready to let go of the version of herself who believed she deserved a wedding day. She stopped eating full meals. She'd buy a pack of crackers and a bottle of water and call it dinner. She called in sick to work 3 days in a row. On the 4th day, her supervisor left a voicemail saying they needed to talk about her attendance. She played it twice and then set the phone face down on the nightstand. She didn't cry. Crying requires something to push against, and there was nothing left inside Denise to resist. She was just hollow. like a bell that had been rung so hard it forgot how to make sound. The worst part wasn't the humiliation. It wasn't the betrayal. It was the math. She kept doing the math. If Marcus had been with Tiffany for a year, that meant he was already with her when he proposed. He was with her during the engagement dinner. He was with her the night he looked Denise in the eyes and said, "You're the only one." Every memory Denise had of the last 2 years now had a shadow standing behind it. Every "I love you" had a footnote. Every night he came home late had an address she didn't know about. Then one night, somewhere around 2 in the morning, she couldn't sleep. She was lying on the motel bed staring at the ceiling when she thought about Mama Opal. Not a big thought, just a small one. The way Mama Opal used to fold towels in thirds. The way she hummed in the kitchen. The way she'd pressed the locket into Denise's palm and say, "When the time comes." Denise sat up. She reached for the old shoebox she'd carried from apartment to apartment for the last 7 years, without ever opening again. It was dented at the corners. The lid didn't sit right anymore. Inside was the sealed envelope from Mama Opal's closet. Her hands were shaking. She tore it open the way you tear a bandage, fast before you can change your mind. Inside was a letter, typed on firm letterhead, from Whitfield and Associates, attorneys at law, Savannah, Georgia. Dated 12 years ago, it was addressed to her, by her full name, and it said she was the sole biological heir of a man named Calvin Monroe. It asked her to contact the firm immediately regarding the administration of a trust established in her name. Denise read the name 3 times. Calvin Monroe. She didn't recognize it. But then she opened the locket, the one she'd worn every day since she was 16, and looked at the faded photo inside. The man with the dark skin and the serious eyes. The man standing in front of a building she didn't recognize. Calvin Monroe. Her father. She sat on that motel bed for an hour without moving, the letter in one hand, the locket in the other, the hum of the ice machine the only sound in the room. She didn't know what the letter meant yet. She didn't know how big the truth was. But she could feel it. The way you feel, weather changing before the skier even shifts. Something enormous was coming, and it had been waiting for her for 12 years. Denise called the number on the letterhead the next morning. A receptionist answered. When Denise gave her name, there was a pause. The kind of pause that told her this wasn't a cold call. They had been waiting. She drove to Savannah 2 days later. The offices of Whitfield and Associates were on a quiet street lined with live oaks in a restored brick building that looked older than the city itself. The receptionist led her to a corner office where a man in his late 60s sat behind a wide mahogany desk. Raymond Whitfield. Silver temples. Reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. The kind of man who looked like he'd carried 1,000 secrets and never spilled one. He stood when Denise walked in. He looked at her for a long time, too long for a stranger. And then he said, "You look just like him." Raymond sat her down and told her everything. Calvin Monroe was her father. He was born in Savannah, grew up poor, and never finished college. But he had an eye for land. He started buying small lots in the early 1980s. Cheap parcels nobody wanted in parts of Atlanta, Savannah, and Charlotte that most investors dismissed as worthless. He bought with cash when he could. He borrowed carefully when he couldn't. He never flipped, he held. He understood something most people didn't, that land in black neighborhoods would one day be worth more than anyone imagined, and the man who held it patiently would build something permanent. By the time Calvin was 45, he owned commercial corridors, mixed-use blocks, and undeveloped lots across 3 cities. He never incorporated under his own name. He built everything through a trust, the Monroe Trust, managed by Raymond's firm. Calvin hated attention. He wore the same 3 suits. He drove a 10-year-old sedan. He ate at the same diner every Thursday. Nobody in his neighborhood knew what he was worth, and he preferred it that way. Calvin met Denise's mother in Savannah. They were together for 2 years. He loved her deeply, quietly, the way he did everything. When she got pregnant, Calvin set up the trust to pass to the child. When she died during delivery, something in Calvin broke. He gave the baby to Mama Opal, his mother's oldest friend, and asked her to raise Denise far away from the world he'd built. He was afraid. He had enemies, developers, distant relatives, people who had already tried to contest the trust once. He didn't want his daughter anywhere near it until she was old enough to protect herself. Calvin died when Denise was 6. Heart attack, alone in his apartment. Raymond found him. The trust was ironclad. Everything, every lot, every block, every lease, passed to Denise. But Mama Opal made Raymond promise to wait. Let the girl grow. Let her be normal. Let her come to the truth on her own terms. So Raymond waited. He managed the trust. He watched the land appreciate year after year, decade after decade, from hundreds of millions into something so large that the number almost didn't feel real. Raymond opened a second folder and slid a photograph across the desk. It was Calvin, standing on a corner in downtown Atlanta, 1994. Behind him was a vacant lot. Raymond said, "That lot is now a 12-story mixed-use building. Your father paid $40,000 for it. It's worth more than most people will see in 10 lifetimes." He let the number sit. Then he said quietly, he did that in almost every neighborhood he touched, for 30 years. And now Denise was sitting across from him, 12 years after the letter was written, in a wrinkled blouse and borrowed shoes, learning that she was one of the wealthiest black women in the American South, and had been since before she could tie her own laces. She didn't react the way Raymond expected. She didn't gasp, didn't cry. She sat still for a long time, the way she always did when the world hit her harder than she was ready for. Then she asked quietly, "Does anyone know?" Raymond shook his head. The trust was private. Calvin's name wasn't public. The properties were managed through holding entities. Nobody knew the face behind the trust. Nobody except Raymond and, now, Denise. Then Raymond told her something that changed the temperature of the room. The Taylor family, Marcus's family, leased 3 of their 4 dealership properties from the Monroe Trust. They had been paying rent to Denise's trust for over a decade without knowing whose name was at the top. Lorraine's church, the church where Denise had been humiliated at the altar, sat on Monroe land. In the Peachtree Grand Banquet Hall, where Lorraine was currently planning a lavish engagement gala for Marcus and Tiffany. That building, that lot, that entire parcel. Monroe Trust. Denise stared at him. She didn't smile. She didn't say anything about revenge. She just touched the locket around her neck, pressed it between her fingers, and closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, she was different. Not angry, not triumphant, just certain. Like something that had been loose her entire life had finally clicked into place. She said one word. "When?" Raymond told her the gala was in 10 days. The Peachtree Grand Banquet Hall was dressed in gold and ivory the night of the gala. Lorraine had spared no expense. Crystal centerpieces, a live jazz quartet in the corner, place cards written in calligraphy. 200 guests filled round tables across a ballroom that smelled like gardenias and ambition. The Taylors were celebrating. Marcus stood near the front in a navy suit with Tiffany beside him, her hand resting on her belly, her smile bright and practiced. Lorraine held a champagne glass and moved through the room like a woman who had won a war and wanted everyone to see the medal. She gave a speech, stood at the front of the room with the microphone and talked about God's plan and the right woman and how sometimes the Lord corrects our path before we even know we've strayed. She thanked the guests. She thanked Marcus. She placed her hand on Tiffany's shoulder and called her the daughter I always prayed for. The room applauded. Then the back doors opened. Denise walked in alone. She wasn't dressed for revenge. She wore a simple black dress. Fitted, clean, no jewelry, except the gold locket resting against her collarbone. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was bare. She looked like she'd come straight from a quiet dinner, not a war room, but something about her presence, the way she moved, the way her eyes held steady, stopped the room before she said a word. Lorraine saw her first. Her champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. Marcus turned. His jaw tightened the way it always did when something was about to go wrong. Tiffany's smile flickered. Denise didn't rush. She walked to the center of the room with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing something no one else in the room knows. She stopped near the front. The jazz quartet trailed off. Forks stopped clinking. 200 people turned to look at the woman Lorraine had stripped bare at the altar 3 weeks ago. Whispers moved through the room like electricity through water. Someone near the bar said, "Is that the girl from the wedding?" A woman at the far table put her hand over her mouth. Marcus's father, seated at the head table, set down his napkin slowly and leaned back in his chair, like a man bracing for impact. He didn't know what was coming, but he could feel it. Lorraine recovered first. She straightened her shoulders and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Sweetheart, this is a private event. I think you're confused about where you belong." A few people chuckled. Nervous, quiet laughter from people who laughed because Lorraine expected them to. Tiffany squeezed Marcus's arm and smirked. Marcus didn't move. He was watching Denise the way you watch someone who isn't behaving the way you predicted. She was supposed to be broken. She was supposed to be gone. She was not supposed to be standing in the middle of this room looking like the only person who knew how the night was going to end. Denise didn't flinch. She turned slightly and gestured toward the back of the room where Raymond Whitfield had just stepped through the doors. He was carrying a leather folder. He walked to Denise's side without hurrying and opened the folder on the nearest table. Denise spoke. Not loud. Not fast. She didn't raise her voice above a conversational tone. She said, "My name is Denise Monroe. My father was Calvin Monroe. He built the Monroe Trust, which owns the building we're standing in tonight." She paused. The room didn't breathe. "It also owns the land beneath 3 of the 4 Taylor family dealerships and the lot where your church sits, Mrs. Taylor." Silence. Not the dramatic kind. The kind where the air leaves the room and nobody can find it. Raymond placed 3 documents on the table. Lease agreements, trust verification, property records. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Marcus's face drained. His hand, which had been resting on the small of Tiffany's back, dropped to his side. Lorraine grabbed the edge of the nearest table like the floor had shifted. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Tiffany looked at Marcus. Not with love, not with worry, but with the sharp, calculating look of a woman already reevaluating her options. Denise watched them, all 3. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't lean in to twist the knife. She stood perfectly still, the locket rising and falling with her breathing, and let the truth do what truth always does when it's been buried too long. It filled the room from the floor up. Then she said, calmly, "All lease agreements with the Taylor family are currently under review. Mr. Whitfield will be in touch." She turned, walked back through the center of the room, past the tables, past the crystal and the calligraphy and the gold ribbons, past 200 people who had watched her be humiliated at an altar and done nothing. She didn't look back. Not once. The doors closed behind her. The jazz quartet didn't start playing again. Nobody picked up their fork. Lorraine was still holding the table. Marcus was staring at the documents. And Tiffany had already taken her hand off her belly and was reaching for her phone. The fall was not loud. It didn't come all at once. It came the way rot comes, slow, quiet, moving through walls before anyone sees the damage. The lease renegotiations arrived first. Raymond's legal team, not Denise personally, she never signed a single vindictive letter, sent standard market-rate proposals to the Taylor family for all 3 dealership locations. The new terms tripled the rent, not out of spite. The old leases had been below market for years because Calvin Monroe never cared about squeezing tenants. But Calvin was gone. The trust was under active management now, and the market was the market. Marcus couldn't afford it. His father called an emergency meeting with their accountant. The numbers didn't work. 3 locations bleeding at once would gut the business within a year. Marcus's father blamed Lorraine for provoking the one person they should have left alone. Lorraine blamed Marcus for not handling Denise when he had the chance. The argument cracked through the Taylor household like lightning through dry wood. Tiffany saw the cracks before anyone else. She was not a woman who waited for buildings to fall. She had moved into Marcus's apartment 2 weeks after the gala, but within a month she was packing. The phone calls dried up. The dinners stopped. Marcus came home one evening to find half the closet empty and a note on the counter that said, "I need space." She moved back to her mother's house in College Park and stopped answering his calls by the second week. Marcus tried to reach Denise. He called her old number. It was disconnected. He drove to the motel where he'd heard she'd been staying. She'd checked out weeks ago. He asked mutual friends. Nobody knew where she was. Nobody had heard from her. She had disappeared the way smoke does, completely, without leaving a trace you could hold. He sat alone in the apartment that used to hold 2 women and now held none. He called his mother. She didn't answer either. Lorraine's fall was worse because it was public. The church lease was not renewed. The Monroe Trust's legal team sent a polite, professional notice. The lease would expire at term and the property would not be available for continued use. No explanation, no negotiation, just a date and a signature. Lorraine fought it. She called lawyers. She called the city council. She called people she hadn't spoken to in years, looking for leverage, looking for a way to make someone listen. Nobody could help. The trust was legal. The decision was final. There was no appeal, no loophole, no generous donation that could reverse what had already been set in motion by paperwork that moved quietly through offices she didn't even know existed. The congregation had to relocate to a rented hall across town. Members started asking questions. Why did we lose the building? What happened? Who did Lorraine offend? The whispers started at the deacon's meeting and spread through the Sunday school rooms like brush fire. Lorraine's reputation, the thing she had polished every Sunday for 30 years, began to come apart at the seams. The same women she had led in prayer now prayed for God to give them a different leader. The same families she had hosted at holiday dinners now declined her invitations. She sat in her living room most days now, alone. The brooch she'd worn to the altar sat in a dish on the hallway table, untouched. The lavender dress was still in the closet. She couldn't look at it without hearing the sound of a veil tearing. And Tiffany. Tiffany vanished the way she had arrived, quietly, strategically, without leaving anything behind that could be traced. She moved, changed her number, told Marcus through her mother that she needed to focus on herself. The baby was real. The love was not. Tiffany had done to Marcus exactly what Marcus had done to Denise, used proximity as a ladder and pulled it up behind her when the view stopped being worth the climb. Marcus understood this, eventually. Not right away. It took months. It took sitting in a half-empty apartment, watching his phone not ring, watching the dealership lot empty one repossession at a time, watching his father stop calling. It took all of that for Marcus to sit at his kitchen table one night and finally say out loud what Denise had asked him the last time they spoke. Did I ever love her? The apartment was dark. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, Atlanta moved the way it always does, fast, bright, indifferent to the people falling behind. Marcus sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the chair across from him, the one Denise used to sit in when they ate dinner together. She always tucked one leg under her. He never told her he noticed that. He never told her a lot of things. He didn't answer himself, because the answer by then would have hurt more than the question. 6 months later, Savannah, late afternoon. The light coming through the trees was gold and thick, the way it gets in Georgia right before the sun gives up and lets the crickets take over. Denise sat on the porch of Mama Opal's house. The house had been restored, new roof, fresh paint, the same creaking porch, but with stronger boards beneath it. The yard was trimmed. The flower bed Mama Opal had kept was back in bloom. Yellow marigolds, purple cone flowers, the same stubborn roses that had been growing against the fence since before Denise was born. She had a glass of sweet tea on the railing. The shoebox sat on the table beside her, open, empty. Every secret it had held was out now, every envelope opened, every question answered. The weight of it was gone, and in its place was something Denise hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than that. Something steadier. Peace. She didn't run the trust from a penthouse downtown. She didn't move into one of the buildings her father had built. She managed it the way Calvin had. Quietly, through Raymond's firm, with clear instructions and careful attention, and no desire for anyone to know her face. She funded scholarships for girls who grew up the way she did. No family name, no safety net, no one standing behind them in the school auditorium clapping. She built a community center in Mama Opal's neighborhood. She named it after her mother, the one she never met, because Mama Opal would have wanted it that way. She didn't think about Marcus. She didn't think about Lorraine. She didn't think about the altar or the veil or the sound of pins hitting a marble floor. Those things lived somewhere behind her now, in a room she had closed and locked, the same way Mama Opal used to close a conversation. Calm, final, no intention of going back. Some mornings she'd walk the dirt road behind the house the way she did when she was small, past the leaning mailbox, past the tree with the low branch she used to hang from, past the neighbor's fence where the dogs used to bark. The road hadn't changed. The trees still hung low enough to touch the roof. The porch still creaked, but Denise walked it differently now. Not like a girl running from something, like a woman who had finally found her way home. She received a letter from Marcus once, handwritten, 3 pages. She recognized the handwriting from the back of grocery lists and sticky notes he used to leave on the counter. She held the envelope for a long time, turning it over, feeling the weight of it. Then she placed it, unopened, in the drawer of Mama Opal's nightstand and closed it. Some doors don't need to be reopened, some letters don't need to be read. She already knew everything those pages could possibly say, and none of it would change what happened at that altar. The locket hung around her neck the way it always had. But now it was open. Calvin's photo faced outward, catching the late Georgia light. Denise touched it once, gently, with her fingertip. Then she picked up her glass, leaned back in the chair, and watched the sun do what it does every evening in Savannah. Fall slowly, beautifully, like it has nowhere else to be. They stripped her bare in front of the world because they thought she was nothing. They ripped the veil from her head because they believed a woman with no name and no family couldn't possibly matter. But the quietest woman in the room was carrying an inheritance they couldn't imagine. Not just money, not just land, but the kind of strength that doesn't need an audience, the kind of worth that doesn't shrink when someone tries to take your crown. Sometimes the people who humiliate you are standing on ground you own. And one day, quietly, without warning, the truth rises. Not to punish, not to perform, just to set the record straight. And Denise? She didn't rise with anger. She rose with her grandmother's posture, her father's patience, and a locket full of proof that she was always more than what they saw. She just had to find out for herself. If this story reminded you that your worth was never decided by the people who couldn't see it, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. And if you're not subscribed yet, come be part of this family. We tell stories here that stay with you long after the screen goes dark.